let's wrap this up. Hey pals, Alyssa here. I hope you are doing well. And if you're new here, this is the place where we talk about books. Today I am here to go over my October wrap up. We're gonna chat about all of the books that I read in the month of October. October was a really great reading month for me. I read 12 books, which is definitely on the high end of the amount of books I've read in a month this year. I participated in Gothtober in October, and that was a lot of fun. Gothtober is a month-long readathon that's hosted by Olivia at Olivia's Catastrophe, Tish at Little Wolf, and Ladette M. I will link all of their information below. There was a whole whack of prompts for Gothtober, and I think I completed all of the themed prompts except for Dark Academia, but I think I did all the rest. So that was, I'm just gonna chalk that up as a success. As usual, I will go over the books in the order of lowest rating to highest rating to build some anticipation there. And yeah, so without further ado, let's just dive in and chat about some books. First up, we've got 7 Years of Darkness by You-Jeong. This is a psychological thriller that was originally published in South Korea in 2011 and then translated into English in 2020. I read this book this month as a buddy read with Kat from Biblio Obscura, and while I absolutely loved buddy reading this with her, I did not love the book itself. This is my second book by You-Jeong, the first one being The Good Son, and if I were going to recommend a book to you by this author, definitely read The Good Son. I absolutely loved The Good Son, and this one was maybe like a 2.5 star for me. So 7 Years of Darkness follows a teenage boy who 7 years prior was kind of part of a huge family tragedy, a huge community tragedy, where his father went on a killing spree, killed his mother and a few other people in the community, and then broke a dam that then flooded an entire city, like an entire village, and then killed a bunch of people in the village as well. So just an absolute tragedy. And then 7 years later, he's now a teenager and he is kind of learning a bit more about what happened that fateful day. So pacing wise, this was a thriller. Like, this was a very like fast-paced, gotta read it really fast kind of novel, so I don't fault it for that. But the way that this story was told was really, I really didn't vibe with it. I feel like it could have been like a past present kind of thing where you're in the present and then you jump into the past. But every time we were hearing about what was happening in the past, it was through like a novelization, like an essay that a different character in the book was writing. So it wasn't even like the real past, it was like someone's interpretation of the past. And I just like, I found that really annoying, and I didn't like that. But yeah, this is a story about gray morality, toxic masculinity, about lying and keeping secrets. Definitely like a family drama. Also, you learn about dams a lot and how dams work. Not my favorite. I gave this 2.5 stars. I didn't like actively hate it, but it just, I've read better thrillers, and I think I was comparing it to The Good Son the entire time I was reading it, which may have been a mistake. So 2.5 stars. And then for Gothtober, I read this for the prompt of lies, the prompt of gray morality, and also the prompt of a book set in a foreign country. It's set in South Korea. Next up, I've got Human Acts by Kang. This was originally published in Korean in 2014 and then translated into English in 2017. This is my second book by Kang. I read The Vegetarian a couple years ago, and I absolutely loved The Vegetarian. And Human Acts, while I absolutely respect and appreciate the storytelling style of this novel. I wasn't as connected with it as I was hoping I might be. Human Acts is an interconnected short story, or almost like a mosaic style novel, where each chapter is following a different person and a different perspective, all surrounding the events of the Gwangju uprising in South Korea in 1980. So I didn't know anything about this event before I read the book, so I did a lot of research through having read it, and that was a really kind of eye-opening, horrible thing to learn about. In this novel, it is all surrounding the death of one young boy and that experience of both his experience, but then all of the people around him, both during this physical uprising, but then also for years and even decades after the fact. So it's a very graphic novel. It's very violent, like trigger warnings for like every part of this. There's one chapter that actually like shows rape on the page, which was like absolutely horrible and brutal to read. And if you've read The Vegetarian, she still employs that same kind of very like poetic language, but explaining things that are absolutely horrible. I don't really know how to talk about this book because I really respected what she was doing by showing these different perspectives to show the kind of both immediate and long-term trauma that this event in South Korean history caused to its citizens. It's fueled by grief, it's fueled by trauma, and it's and it's just a really upsetting book to read that's illustrating a very real feeling and a very real piece of history. So I absolutely appreciate it for what it is. I don't know, I didn't connect with this as the writing of this as much as I thought I would. I gave it 3 stars. Next up, we've got The Houseguest and Other Stories by Amparo Dávila. It was originally published in Spanish in 2009 and then translated into English in 2018. This is a gothic horror short story collection. I read this for the Gothtober prompt of grey morality. I wasn't actually sure if there was grey morality within these stories, but there definitely was. This was such an interesting collection. I definitely recommend for fans of gothic horror. Also, I've heard this compared to Shirley Jackson, and I think I would definitely agree. These were all horror short stories that were following themes of obsession and paranoia and fear. There was always like very unsettling psychological elements to all of these stories. The first 2 were absolute bangers. Those were incredible. And then the rest of them were still good, but not as good as the first 2. So my kind of impression of the collection kind of went down a bit. I've given this about a 3.5 stars overall. A few of the stories later on felt kind of samey, but definitely there weren't any that I did not enjoy in this collection. One thing to note is I could see people being frustrated by this collection if you feel like you need an absolutely wrapped up ending. A lot of these stories have very ambiguous endings. A lot of these stories deal with the themes of like paranoia and fear and obsession, where you're in one person's head, but you never really get the full resolution of what's going on around this person. And I found that exploration really fascinating, and I really loved that. But I could see somebody else reading this and being like, well, what even happened here? Like nothing even happened in the story. So just a little note about that. But I really like this. I would definitely read more from this author in the future. I don't even know where this book came into my awareness. It just came out of nowhere, and I'm glad I read this. I gave this 3.5 stars, and I would recommend for fans of gothic horror and Shirley Jackson. Next up, we've got another horror short story collection. We've got Autumncrow by Chaney, and this was published in 2019, and I read this for the Gothtober prompt of a book with bones on the cover, and there's some good spooky bones here. I would definitely recommend reading this book in the Halloween months, in the spooky season. When I read this, was just the absolute perfect time to do so. Chaney is a fellow booktuber. I'll link his channel below. And this short story collection is a collection of interconnected horror short stories, all surrounding the community of Autumncrow. And I absolutely loved that interconnected nature of this collection, where you'd have, like, as you went from story to story, they were all complete standalone stories, but then you'd see elements weaved throughout that connected to other stories. So there were a few absolute standout stories in this collection, and there weren't really any that I didn't like. My favorites were Follow Me In, Burnt Brownies, and I Have No Mouth and I Must Feed. Those three stories were amazing. I absolutely loved them. Gave me some shivers. I had some goosebumps reading them. Yeah, I would definitely recommend this. I gave this 4 stars, and I will definitely keep an eye out for what Chaney has coming out in the future. Next up, we've got The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollack. This was published in 2011 and was a debut novel, which is absolutely mind-blowing to learn. I read The Devil All the Time for the Gothic prompt. I think I had pegged The Devil All the Time as a Southern Gothic story, and I'm not actually sure if that is true or not, but whatever it was, The Devil All the Time is set at the end of the Second World War. We are set in rural Ohio, and we are following a diverse ranging cast of characters, from a corrupt cop to some really weird preachers, to some drive around serial killers, to a veteran with PTSD and his wife and his son. And we are just following this novel as these different people's lives intersect at different points in time, and just the absolute, just like cosmic precision with which these lives intersect, and how horrible and brutal and ugly that is. Like, I absolutely loved this novel. It was just an incredible ride where nothing good happens at all, and no one in it is like truly righteous and like truly great. It's all just like a cast of insidious and broken and haunted and like very gray, sometimes very evil characters, and just the beautiful tapestry of how they intersect. This felt so accomplished to me. There are some really brutal scenes in here. It's told through a series of parts, and I even remember just like part 1 on its own felt like an entire novel. I read part 1 and I was just like, what? There's still like 200 more pages? Like this on its own could have been its own thing. So definitely there was a lot of hype around this for me when I read it. Definitely lived up to it. I will definitely read more by this author in the future. I will admit I wanted to read it and then go watch the movie, and I got like 20 minutes into the movie and I was just like, they have changed too much. I am mad. So I have the movie on pause, and let me know, actually, if you've read the book and watched the movie, let me know if the movie is worth watching, because I was immediately not into it. I definitely recommend the book. I gave this 4 stars. Will read more from Donald Ray Pollack in the future. This book will make you feel like trash. Next up, we've got a horror novella. We've got Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. We are following a 15-year-old Blackfeet teen, and his father has passed away several years in the past, but all of a sudden he feels like he starts to see his father's kind of ghost visiting his house at night dressed in full Blackfeet regalia. And this boy doesn't actually know a lot about his father. The kind of circumstances around his father's death have been hidden from him. And so he is immediately really excited, being like, oh, it's my father. I'll get to reconnect with my father and make up for lost time. But then this just kind of unravels into something much darker and much more insidious. So this is definitely a family drama at its core, with elements of psychological horror, elements of visceral, brutal body horror, and then also just a little bit of a ghost story. I absolutely loved this, even though it is quite traumatic. It's very dark. It definitely follows themes of like the family legacy and heritage. This blew me away. I gave this 4 stars and definitely want to continue reading Stephen Graham Jones in the future. I read Mapping the Interior for the Gothtober prompt of a book featuring an undead character. Next up, we've got Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. This was a debut novel that was published in 2018. This was unlike anything I have ever read before, and it was just a really incredible, it was a very incredible reading experience. Freshwater is kind of a literary exploration of identity and the self and gender and trauma, all told through the kind of exploration of an individual containing multiple selves. And I feel like even saying that is a very subjective interpretation of what is going on in Freshwater, which is just it's really exciting to read a novel that I feel like is inviting the reader to interpret the novel in so many different ways. So in this, we are following a person named Ada growing up in Nigeria and then going to the United States to go to university. And the whole novel is told, it is about Ada, and it is about Ada's perspective and point of view, but we are learning about Ada through these different selves who are within Ada and have been a part of Ada from birth, but that also existed before Ada was even an idea. Before Ada was even the concept of having been born, these selves that are within Ada existed. I loved this. I loved the kind of lyrical and subjective storytelling that was going on here. But also just note there are trigger warnings for rape and abuse, just to be mindful of that before you dive into this. It deals with very heavy topics. I absolutely loved this, and I gave this 4 stars. Next up, we've got Fools by Pat Cadigan. This is a science fiction cyberpunk story that was published in 1992. I read this for the My So-Called Book Club hosted by Bert over at Pastorytime, and I actually read this book as a buddy read with Bert, and I am just thrilled by the experience of Fools. Fools is cyberpunk at its best. Also, you can't tell me that this isn't Mads Mikkelsen on the cover, right? That's definitely Mads. Mads right there. So, what even is Fools? What even is Fools about? This is a cyberpunk story. We are following a cast of characters who are all living in this kind of virtual reality world where you can consume and experience other people's lives. You can consume other people's memories, their dreams, their fantasies. You can basically pay to experience any experience that isn't innately your own, but live it as if it is your own. And we are following a cast of characters who may or may not be living in the same body, who may or may not be the same person. There is just so much going on in this story, and it is designed to kind of confuse you, and it is designed to kind of keep you on your toes, and just like you start this novel running and you never really stop running, trying to catch up to what exactly is going on. And I found that experience really exciting. I loved just knowing that I was in capable hands, and I was just letting myself go on this journey that Pat Cadigan was weaving for me, and I was just letting it happen to me. I was letting the experience go and just seeing where we went. So there was kind of an element of freedom in reading this, and not really trying to be like, okay, this is this and this is that, because every time I tried to do that, my expectations were completely subverted, and we would just go somewhere else and in a different direction. So with that in mind, I don't recommend this to everyone. I feel like you need to be able to be quite willing to not know what's going on if you want to read Fools. But with all that being said, this novel has some incredible conversations about the self, about identity, about how much of a person is shaped by the experiences that they have, or how much of you is just something that was innately you. And I feel like the fact that this was written in 1992, I feel like Pat Cadigan really predicted the internet and virtual reality and all where that was going. I feel like there was a lot of this reading this being like, oh, well, isn't that just like now? Like, aren't we, by going through the internet, we are kind of living vicariously through other people's lives. We are experiencing other people's experience. So yeah, I felt like this was really interesting to read this now. But then that being said, there were still some things that I didn't understand, and I feel like I'd have to read it again a couple more times to like fully 100% understand this, but that didn't stop me from absolutely enjoying this. I also really got extra out of this by buddy reading it with Bert, so I feel like if you are going to pick up Fools, I think reading it with somebody to bounce ideas off of them, or just to find a sense of place, figure out to ground yourself in it, would be really great. Also, the fact that this was written by a woman and is about the cyberpunk genre in the 90s was also really cool to experience, because I feel like cyberpunk science fiction, especially in the 90s, is a genre that was, you know, dominated by men, but Pat Cadigan tells an incredible story, a female-centered story. So that was just really interesting, and something that I haven't really read before, that kind of perspective. So love this, gave this 4 stars, still confused. Next up, we've got Exhalation by Ted Chiang. This is a science fiction, speculative fiction short story collection. This was published in 2019, and I read this as a buddy read with Rachel from Let Me Into the Library, and this was so good. But again, I knew I was gonna love this. Exhalation contains some of the most eye-opening, mind-bending speculative fiction stories I have ever read. I will admit that while I loved Exhalation, it did not beat out Stories of Your Life. I gave this collection 4 stars. There were some absolute incredible stories in here. Some of my absolute standouts in this collection were The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate, which is a story of time travel. Exhalation, which is the title story, is beautiful and it made me cry. The Life Cycle of Software Objects is the longest story in this collection. I think it's like, it's like 130 pages, so that's like a novella on its own. Was a beautiful story. And The Great Silence were my standouts. The thing about Ted Chiang that I love is that in his stories, he always picks up themes of technology, philosophy, humanity, religion. He picks up these really powerful themes and then explores ideas in his stories that he doesn't feel obligated to answer. And I really love that. So there's always like an element of ambiguity. There's always an element of continuing on and thinking going on in there. And that's just, yeah, I feel like that's really a really powerful form of storytelling, because as the reader, you are really brought into that experience to think about this as well, like concepts that you've never really thought about before. So if you are interested in the merging of philosophy and technology, if you are a fan of Black Mirror but without the like horror elements, more of just like the exploration elements, I definitely recommend Ted Chiang. I loved Exhalation. I gave this 4 stars. Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Bazterrica. This is a 2020 release that I read for the Gothtober prompt of reading a book with red on the cover. I also read this as a buddy read with Amelia Reads, and I loved Tender is the Flesh. This is a book that I loved but will absolutely never even consider reading again. So Tender is the Flesh is about a dystopian world where something has happened in the past that has made animal meat toxic to humans. So humans can no longer consume animal meat. They'll die from it if they do. So instead of turning the world into, you know, a vegetarian world, instead of doing that, we have gone through the process of cultivating humans for food. So now there's kind of 2 kinds of humans in the world. There's the humans that exist and just live their lives, and then there are the humans that are grown as meat, and they're grown in facilities and then slaughtered and then turned into special meat and then eaten. It's just the world continues as normal with a twist. And we are following a man named Marcos who works in one of these human slaughterhouses. He works in like a human processing facility, and we just basically follow his day-to-day of slaughtering humans until something happens to him one day. So that's just kind of the conceit. I felt like I thought a lot more reading this than I thought I would. I was kind of just expecting like some body horror of humans being chopped up and eaten, and there's definitely that. It is definitely disgusting and brutal for that. But I feel like weaved within this are very loud conversations about the meat industry today in general. The way that the human beings are processed in these slaughterhouses is grotesque, but there is absolutely no difference between what's happening in this book and the way that meat is processed, like animal meat is processed for consumption today. So I feel like she was definitely drawing that parallel of the inhumanity of the meat industry, but also this has really like eloquent conversations about depression and grief. Marco's life has been one of tragedy, and I feel like his characterization was extremely real and dark, and just, I don't know, it was a very interesting character to read. I absolutely loved it. The bleakness of it just really, I really messed with it. So I gave this 4 stars. Wonderful. Absolutely loved it. Will never read it again. It is disgusting. So next up, we've got Ring Shout by Djèlí Clark. This was a 2020 release, and this was one of my most anticipated books of the year, and this definitely did not disappoint. I just finished Ring Shout last night, and I'm still kind of reeling from it. In Ring Shout, we are set in 1915, and this is a dark historical fantasy that is kind of telling the birth of the KKK, but with a fantastical and supernatural twist. The conceit of this is that the filmmaker D.W. Griffith, who made just the absolute ghastly film A Birth of a Nation, he wasn't just a filmmaker, he was a dark sorcerer. And his film is actually a spell that was cast upon white America to both feed and fuel their racism and their hatred. So it's about Klansmen and the KKK, and if you really feed your hatred as a Klansman, you then become changed into this grotesque racist monster. We are also following this woman named Maurice Bordeaux, and she is a whiskey smuggler by day, and then by night she has this magic sword that she uses to kill the Klansmen monsters, but then also just fights racism and hatred. So it's full on like a fantasy adventure novel. I highly recommend this. My only thing that bothers me about this book is that it wasn't longer. This is only 180 pages, and so much is introduced in this that I want so much more. Every character that was introduced in this is so compelling that you just want a full novel of their whole entire backstory. Djèlí Clark, in his afterword, said that he wanted a sword-wielding hero fantasy adventure, but not set in an alternate world. He wanted something that had all of those elements of fantasy, but set in our world and set in actual historical fact, and he has done exactly that with Ring Shout. This blew me away, definitely lived up to the hype that I had built for it and the hype that everybody else had built for it, and I definitely recommend. I gave this 4 stars just because I wanted more. Finally, we've got my only 5-star read of the month, and that is When No One Is Watching, a thriller by Alyssa Cole. So I read thrillers from time to time. I like thrillers, I can mess with thrillers, but very rarely do I have a lasting impression from a thriller. But When No One Is Watching is a thriller, but it is so much more than that, and it absolutely blew me away. It blew my mind. I'm almost even wondering if this was mismarketed as a thriller, because it definitely felt more like a horror. This is marketed as Rear Window meets Get Out, and it is absolutely that. Also, if you read and liked Lakewood by Megan Giddings that came out this year, definitely check out When No One Is Watching. This is another incredible 2020 release. In When No One Is Watching, we are following 2 characters. It is dual perspective. We are following Sydney, who is a Black woman living in her mother's brownstone in a community in Brooklyn that she grew up in. And then we are also following a 30-something white man named Theo, who with his girlfriend bought one of the brownstones in the same community and has moved in. So we've got these 2 different perspectives here. And Sydney is just noticing that the community around her is very rapidly gentrifying. Gentrification has been happening for a while, but just within the last few months, it's just happening too fast. Some of her neighbors who have lived there forever have just up and moved out without telling anybody, and she just thinks that's strange. So she kind of does a bit of detective work to try and figure out what's going on in her community. So that's the general conceit. And through this novel, you learn so much about actual systemic racism within America and how gentrification and redlining has just destroyed communities for years. And I think the reason why this was extra horrifying and extra thrilling is because everything that is explored in this novel through the guise of a thriller is based in fact. And it is based in history. Nothing that happens in here hasn't already happened or isn't already happening. I've read a few reviews out there that said the pacing was off, or it just felt like it got too far-fetched in the end, but I respectfully disagree, and this just was incredible. And I highly, highly recommend. I gave this 5 stars, and I just want to give this to everyone and make everyone read it. I read when no one is watching for the Gothtober prompt to read a book with a female protagonist. There you have it, pals. These were the 12 books that I read in the month of October. Let me know if you read any of these and what you thought. Let me know if you want to read any of these and we can chat about it. So thanks again for being here, pals. I just absolutely love talking about books with you all. Every single one of you is a diamond. So take care out there. Stay well, stay safe, stay spooky, and until next time, I'll see you back.